Hey guys, hope you're doing well, and let's continue with the topic of how a monopolist behaves. So in this video, we're going to talk about, you should know what the outcome is for perfect competition. Now you should also know what the outcome is for a monopolist in terms of how much they produce, what price they charge, and how do we get to their profits or losses. So in this video, we're going to compare the outcomes for, between perfect competition and monopoly to see which one is better in terms of the point of view from the producers and consumers. But you have to be very thorough on everything in relation to how monopolist behaves and how a perfectly competitive firm behaves before you understand this video. If that all is clear, this is going to be a very easy and a quick video for you. All right, so for a perfectly competitive firm, we know that price equals MR equals MC. In the optimal outcome in the long run, that's always going to be true. In fact, in the long run, that's also going to equal ATC. Right? But regardless of long run or short run, that's going to be true. For a monopolist, price is going to be more than MR and MC. So MR equaling MC is always going to be true because that tells us how much to produce. So both a monopolist and a perfectly competitive firm first look at where MR equals MC because that tells them what quantity they should both produce. However, in terms of the price, a perfectly competitive firm cannot charge a price higher than the market price, which ends up being MR. So they're all equal. However, for a monopolist, the price that a monopolist charges is more, and you should refer to your graphs from the previous couple of videos to make sure you understand that, more than the marginal cost. So what this tells us is the price per unit that a monopolist is able to charge is more than what it's costing them to produce that unit. That's what MC tells us. But a perfectly competitive firm is able to charge the same exact price as it's costing them to make that last unit. So in terms of the graph, let me quickly just draw it out. So if you have the demand curve, now I'm going to look at both markets, a perfectly competitive market and the monopolist, because that's how we compare the two markets. It's hard to draw a firm and a market graph on the same. That is not going to make much sense. So this is your MR, and this is your, I'm just going to assume simplest case, MC is constant. I talked about this in the last video. So for a monopolist, we first say, okay, this is, let me change the color. So this is where a monopolist produces, and then you take it straight up to the demand curve. This is where a monopolist, what price a monopolist charges. For perfect competition, if you remember, MC also represented their supply curve. So for a perfectly competitive market, they will produce this quantity and charge this price. And this is the quantity by perfect competition. So you can see that a perfectly competitive market as a whole produces more than one monopolist, and they charge a price that's below what a monopolist charges as well. Right? So if you understood the last two chapters, that should be nothing new. All right, so that's, I'm just concluding what I talked about in the previous slide. In contrast to a competitive firm, the monopolist charges a price that's higher and produces quantity that's lower in relation to what a perfectly competitive firm charges. So therefore, from the point of view of the consumers, we prefer perfect competition. But from the point of view of a monopolist, they prefer to be a monopoly than operate in a perfectly competitive market because they're charging a price more than MC. And they continue to charge that in the long run because there are barriers to entry. Right? So then the obvious question is, are monopolists good or bad? And the answer is, it's not as simple as yes or no. Why do monopolies exist? So one reason we talked about economies of scale a long time ago is that economies of scale mean that if you are producing more quantity, your average cost goes down. So you're operating on the downward sloping part of your average total cost. Now, if that's the scenario, in that case, one firm can produce at a lower average cost than more than one firm. So in that case, we probably want one firm to produce and not more than one firm's. And that's why in a lot of cases, utilities, providing water to a house or providing electricity are examples of why monopolies exist. In some cases, monopoly powers, they're exaggerated a little bit more. In the pharmaceutical industry, when they come up with a new, medicine for consumers, they're allowed in most countries to get patents, which means they're the only producer for X number of years. So they're a monopoly. However, patents expire after 10 years, and in that case, they are no longer a monopolist because other firms can enter the market. And one thing is, how do you define the market? If you define the market very broadly, then there might be more substitutes. But if you define the market very narrowly, then it might seem like a firm is a monopolist when they really are not in a broader market. So again, I'm not trying to defend the fact that monopolies are good. We know that we want perfect competition. But there are some exceptions where it makes sense for there to be fewer firms than than the number of firms in a perfectly competitive market. In some instances, you require a lot of upfront cost, right? There are huge fixed costs to come up with new medicines. pharmaceutical companies have to incur a lot of expenses in terms of technology and money on R&D, research and development. So it might make sense for one firm to spend all that money and then recover to become, in the way of acting like a monopolist for 10 years, which, in the US, that's how much time you can be a monopolist if you get patent. And then over time, it goes down, right? But the point here is that in some instances, you have to provide a producer to be the only producer to sell a good for a certain amount of time for them to even spend so much upfront cost, right? So there are some, these are the only exceptions where where one can justify there to be just one producer, right? And I would say 99% of the goods we buy are not a monopolist. They're going to be somewhere in between perfect competition and monopoly, which is going to be the next video. We've talked about perfect competition, we've talked about monopoly, what comes in between? Because both of those endpoints are not very likely, not the most common markets we see. But it's important to understand the endpoints so we can understand what comes in between as well. So this is just looking at the example of a pharmaceutical company. If the government allots them a monopoly to where they are the only producer for X number of years, they produce where MR equals MC, then that's the demand curve, that's the price they charge. However, once the patent expires, now the market becomes competitive. Anyone can enter if they choose to, which now then says that this is where the market is going to be, right? So in perfect competition, we operate where the demand curve intersects the MC curve, not where we are looking at MR, because each firm is not subject to the demand curve like a monopolist is. So a perfectly competitive market will produce more and charge a price that's lower than a monopolist. So if you're talking about industries where companies get patents, it's okay to have monopolies if they're justified, because eventually monopoly power runs out. Right? So that's the whole example. And pharmaceutical industry is a good example to look at and talk about when we're talking about patents, because that's where you go from a company being a monopoly for a while to then becoming more competitive. All right, so in today's video, you should have a good understanding of how perfect competition at one end operates, a perfectly competitive firm operates in terms of how much they produce, what their profit margins are, what the relationship is between P and MC, and at the other end, other extreme end, a monopolist. In the next video, we're going to look at two markets which are oligopoly and monopolistic competition and see how they fit in between the two endpoints. So review this material, and we are getting ready to conclude this chapter in the next video as well.